On the 5th of May 1838, 396 people stepped off two ships at a place called Highbury on the coast of British Guiana. They had crossed an ocean. Most of them had no real idea where they were going or how long they'd agreed to stay. They walked onto a sugar plantation that had been worked by enslaved men and women just 5 years earlier. The man who owned that plantation was the father of a future British Prime Minister. Britain had just spent £20 million abolishing slavery, and here it was, replacing it on the very same land, with a new kind of unfree labour imported specially for the job. At the centre of all of it was something so ordinary you probably added a spoonful to your tea this morning. Sugar. That was 1838. But the story of how Britain got hooked on sugar and what that habit cost the people who grew it and the people who ate it starts a little earlier, at the exact moment slavery was supposed to have ended for good. In 1833, Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act. It's remembered as a moment of national conscience, the year Britain freed its enslaved people across the Caribbean. The reality was messier and far less noble. Freedom didn't arrive all at once. Instead, an apprenticeship system kicked in, forcing the newly freed to keep working for their old masters, unpaid or barely paid, for years afterwards. And the government didn't compensate the people who'd been enslaved. It compensated the people who'd owned them. £20 million went to former slaveholders, a sum so large it swallowed roughly 40% of the entire annual government budget. One man alone, a Liverpool merchant named John Gladstone, collected around £106,769 for the loss of over 2,000 enslaved people across 9 plantations. That's a fortune worth well over £10 million today, paid to one family for people who received nothing at all. John Gladstone didn't just bank the money and move on. He had sugar estates in Demerara, in British Guiana, and those estates needed hands in the fields. Apprenticeship was due to run out, and he could see the labour disappearing with it. So in 1836 he wrote to a trading house in Calcutta, Gillanders, Arbuthnot and Company, and asked a simple, chilling question. Could they send him 100 young able-bodied labourers under contract to work his plantations once the old system expired? This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. 2 years later, in May of 1838, the Whitby and the Hesperus dropped anchor at Highbury Burbis, and the men aboard walked ashore into the very fields where slavery had run just a few years before. They'd been recruited largely from the Chota Nagpur and Bankura districts of Bengal. Many later said they hadn't understood the voyage, the destination, or the length of the contract they'd apparently agreed to. Britain called it Indenture. It looked, in almost every practical respect, exactly like what it had just claimed to abolish. This is where the story stops being about one plantation and becomes something far bigger. The Gladstone coolies, as they were called at the time, were the opening shipment of a labour system that would eventually move over 1.2 million Indians to sugar colonies around the world, from Guyana to Mauritius to Fiji, a system that would run without real reform for nearly 80 years, until 1917. Full emancipation finally took hold across the British Caribbean later in 1838, ahead of schedule, after public outcry forced the apprenticeship system to end early. But by then, planters had already found their replacement. Indentured labour from India, contracted for 5 years at a time, became the backbone of the sugar industry Britain depended on. The morality of 1833 had lasted about as long as it took planters to find a workaround. While all of this was unfolding thousands of miles away, sugar itself was still, for most people in Britain, a controlled and modest household expense. Duties on foreign sugar remained protective through the 1840s, keeping colonial sugar's price advantage intact and consumption relatively steady. A middle-class household used sugar daily, in tea, in baking, as a small treat. A poor household used it sparingly, a precious ingredient rather than a staple. Around the year 1800, the average Briton got through roughly 18 pounds of sugar a year. That's a modest amount, spread thin across months, nothing like what was coming. And then, in 1846, Parliament did something that stunned abolitionists and free traders alike, for very different reasons. Lord John Russell's government, with Charles Wood as Chancellor, passed the Sugar Duties Act, phasing in equal tariffs on foreign and colonial sugar. It sounds technical. It wasn't. It meant deliberately opening the British market to sugar grown by enslaved people in Cuba and Brazil, where slavery remained completely legal. 13 years after Britain congratulated itself for buying out its own slaveholders, Parliament voted to make it cheaper to buy sugar grown by someone else's slaves. The West India planters were furious because it undercut their prices. Abolitionist campaigners were furious for the opposite reason, because it rewarded the very system Britain claimed to have destroyed. Both sides lost the argument to a third, quieter force: cheapness. The act passed anyway, riding the same free trade wave that scrapped the Corn Laws that same year. Sugar prices began falling through the late 1840s, and consumption started climbing out of its early Victorian plateau for the first time. Through the 1850s and 60s, the indenture system Gladstone had pioneered became a large, formalized, government-regulated trade in human beings who were, on paper, free. Contracts typically bound a laborer to 5 years of work. Wages were poor. Overseer discipline was harsh. Mortality on the crossing and on the estates ran high. Investigators repeatedly described conditions as slavery in all but name. And yet the system didn't shrink under that criticism. It grew because Britain's appetite for sugar kept climbing, and someone had to grow it. At the same time, a new competitor entered the picture from an unexpected direction. European beet sugar, developed decades earlier under Napoleon specifically to dodge British naval blockades, matured into serious industrial competition from France and Germany. Two very different sources, cane and beet, were now both pushing prices down at once. It was in this climate that the men who'd come to define British sugar started building their fortunes. In 1859, a Liverpool grocer named Henry Tate went into partnership with a refiner called John Wright, the first step toward what would become one of the great sugar dynasties of the age. Sugar refining itself was brutalizing work, concentrated in port cities like Liverpool, Greenock, London and Bristol, where refineries ran boiling vats of sugar liquor in scalding heat, thick with molasses fumes, staffed disproportionately by German immigrant labor in London's East End sugar houses. In 1865, a Greenock shipowner named Abram Lyle bought a stake in the Glebe sugar refinery in Scotland. Neither Tate nor Lyle yet knew they'd end up sharing a name on the same company. And in the same decade, two Quaker family firms, Fry's in Bristol and Cadbury's in Birmingham, began expanding chocolate confectionery production, feeding the exact same national sweet tooth that jam and sugared tea were about to feed on a much larger scale. What nobody realized at the time was how completely sugar was about to take over the ordinary British table, and what that would eventually do to the people eating it. 1846 had reopened the door to slave-grown sugar for the sake of a lower price. Now the 1870s were about to knock that door off its hinges completely. By the early 1870s, the industrial machinery of sugar refining had reached a genuinely staggering scale. In 1872, Henry Tate and Sons opened a major new refinery at Love Lane on the Liverpool docks. It turned out roughly 400 tons of sugar a week. Picture that. 400 tons every week from a single site, feeding into a national appetite that was only just getting started. A year later, in 1873, Abram Lyle's refining partner John Kerr died, and Lyle sold his shares in the Glebe refinery in Greenock and began planning something bigger of his own, a new works on the Thames. Then, in February of 1874, William Ewart Gladstone's Liberal government delivered its final budget, before losing that year's general election, and it went out with the single most consequential piece of sugar policy of the entire century. The last remaining import duty on sugar was abolished completely, effective from the 21st of May, 1874. It was the capstone of what Gladstone called the free breakfast table, cheap tea, and now completely untaxed sugar for the working man's kitchen. Before this, sugar had carried a heavy tax that kept its price artificially high for ordinary households. After it, that tax was simply gone. And here's the detail that makes this story turn on itself. The Prime Minister whose reform stripped away the last barrier to cheap sugar was the son of the very man who'd pioneered indentured labor on sugar plantations 36 years earlier. William Ewart Gladstone never publicly drew that line between his father's fortune and his own budget, but the line was there whether he acknowledged it or not. The son made affordable the exact commodity the father had restructured an entire system of unfree labor to keep producing. The effect on ordinary households was immediate, and it wasn't subtle. Sugar dropped within reach of every family's weekly shop, not as an occasional treat, but as a daily staple. And this is where the story stops being about tariffs and refineries and starts being about what actually ended up on the table. That same year, 1874, William Pickles Hartley's jam business, which he'd started 3 years earlier in Colne after a fruit supplier let him down, relocated to Bootle near Liverpool and expanded into marmalade and jelly. Hartley marketed his jam on a single pointed promise. It contained only fruit and sugar. That promise mattered because most cheap jam on the market at the time didn't. It was routinely bulked out with turnip and carrot pulp, dyed and flavored to resemble strawberry or plum, sold to families who had no way of knowing the difference and no money to demand better. Even Hartley's honestly made product, the pure version, was still routinely around 2/3 sugar to 1/3 actual fruit pulp. Read that again. 2/3 sugar. This wasn't fruit preserve with a bit of sweetener added. It was sugar flavored with fruit, sold to the poor as food because it was cheaper than butter and it filled a hungry stomach fast. In 1875, Tate acquired exclusive British rights to Swiss and German cube sugar technology, and the sugar cube arrived in British homes. A small, neat, entirely unremarkable convenience. Think about what that says. A substance so rare a century earlier that it was weighed out by the apothecary like medicine had become so thoroughly normal that it now came pre-portioned for convenience, dropped into a teacup without a second thought. Through the late 1870s and into the 1880s, bread and jam, washed down with tea stirred thick with sugar, became the default meal of the urban poor, and especially of poor children. Not a snack, not a treat, the meal. Breakfast, and often dinner and tea besides, was a slice of bread scraped with 2/3 sugar jam and a mug of oversweetened tea. It filled a stomach cheaply and quickly, and it delivered almost nothing else the body actually needed. In 1883, Abram Lyall's new refinery at Plaistow, in West Silvertown-on-the-Thames, began production, and a byproduct of the refining process, thick, dark treacle, was bottled and sold as golden syrup. It wasn't even meant to be the main event. It was runoff, and within its first year on the market, Lyle & Sons was selling roughly a ton of it a week, purely because it was cheap, it kept, and it was sweet enough to satisfy a craving the whole country had developed almost overnight. The clock was already ticking on all of this. Nobody buying a spoonful of golden syrup in 1883, and nobody spreading jam on bread in a tenement kitchen in Bootle or Bethnal Green could hear it yet. But somewhere in the mouths of the children eating that bread and jam every single day, the bill for cheap sugar was already being written, one rotting tooth at a time. By the 1880s, that bill was arriving in full. Dentists working in poor districts started reporting something that would have seemed unthinkable a generation earlier. Having your own natural teeth left by middle age was becoming the exception among the poor, not the rule. Decay had once been almost a mark of privilege because only the wealthy had been able to afford enough sugar to rot their teeth. Now it belonged to everyone, and it hit the poor hardest of all, because the poor were the ones eating bread and jam 3 meals a day and had no money whatsoever for a dentist to fix what that diet was doing to them. This is where most people get the story wrong. They assume dentistry simply hadn't caught up yet, that Victorian teeth were rotten because Victorian medicine was primitive. That's not what happened. Dentistry was professionalizing at exactly this moment. The Dentists Act of 1878 restricted who could legally call themselves a dentist, the first real regulation of the trade in British history. The problem wasn't a lack of expertise. It was access. A trained dentist cost money a labouring family simply didn't have. So the professionalization of dentistry ran on one track for the middle classes who could pay, while an entirely different track ran for the poor. And on that track, a rotten tooth just got pulled, or left to rot further, or ignored until it killed the nerve on its own. 2 nations, one sitting in a dentist's chair, the other losing teeth in childhood and simply living with the gaps. And it wasn't only teeth. Sugar was doing something quieter and just as damaging to the working class diet as a whole. By the century's end, sugar supplied roughly 1/5 of the average Briton's daily calories. A fifth. Food that fueled the body but gave it almost nothing to build with. No protein, no vitamins, nothing a growing child actually needed. And because bread and jam were so cheap and so filling, they crowded out meat, vegetables and dairy in exactly the households that could least afford to skip them. A mother feeding a family on a laborer's wage wasn't choosing sugar because she didn't understand nutrition. She was choosing it because it was the only thing that reliably kept hunger quiet until the next meal. And reliably keeping hunger quiet was the whole battle. Meanwhile, down in the corner shops that were springing up on every working class street, sugar had completed its journey from rare luxury to the cheapest pleasure a child could buy. Through the 1890s, boiled sweets, penny sweets and toffee became fixtures of working class childhood, sold loose from open jars for a fraction of a penny, affordable even to a child spending a found coin or a laborer's spare change. Shops sold sugar itself loose by the ounce, scooped and weighed across the counter like it always had been, except now everyone, not just the comfortable, could afford to buy it. A stuff once prescribed by apothecaries in tiny, careful quantities was now sold to children in fistfuls for a farthing. By 1900, the numbers had reached a scale that would have been unimaginable to anyone alive at the start of the Queen's reign. The average Briton was eating roughly 90 pounds of sugar a year. 90 pounds? That works out to 1.5 pounds of sugar every single week, for every man, woman and child in the country, rich or poor, whether they could afford it or not. Compare that to the 18 pounds a year the average person had eaten, back in 1800. In 1 century, British sugar consumption had risen 5-fold, and almost all of that rise had happened inside Victoria's own reign. Global sugar production told the same story from the supply side. Roughly 570,000 tons produced worldwide in 1830 had become 6.1 million tons by 1890, a 10-fold increase in 60 years, driven by industrial cane refining in places like Love Lane and Plaistow, and by the rise of European beet sugar working in parallel. Here is the argument this whole story has been building toward, and it's worth stating plainly. Britain told itself a clean, simple story about 1833, slavery ended, conscience settled. Sugar is the proof that it hadn't. In 1846, Parliament reopened British shelves to sugar grown by people who were still, undisguisedly, enslaved in Cuba and Brazil, 13 years after paying £20 million to end slavery in its own colonies. The indentured labour system that replaced slavery on Britain's own plantations, the one that began with John Gladstone's own estates, and the ships Whitby and Hesperus in 1838, was free only on paper. In lived reality, for the men recruited out of Bengal who didn't understand where they were going or how long they'd be bound, it looked very much like the thing it was supposed to have replaced, and the sugar that all of this labour, free and unfree, legal and barely legal, produced, turned out to be quietly destroying the health of the very British public that was so proud of having ended slavery in the first place. Nobody in government connected the 1874 budget to the dental epidemic of the 1880s. Nobody was supposed to. That was rather the point of how the whole system worked. Britain congratulated itself loudly for the thing it had abolished, and said almost nothing at all about the thing it had simply relabeled and kept running underneath. The scale of that indentured system deserves a harder look, because the number everyone remembers is the shipment. It's rarely the total. Over the 80 years the system ran, from those first ships at Highbury in 1838 to its formal end, in 1917, well over 1.2 million Indians were carried to sugar colonies across the British Empire. Guyana alone took in something like 240,000 of them. 80 years. 80 years of 5-year contracts, renewed and re-signed, generation after generation, on the same fields that slavery had worked before them. A labourer who survived one contract often had little choice but to sign another, because passage home wasn't guaranteed, and the money to buy a life back in Bengal never quite materialized on an indenture wage. Mortality on the ships crossing the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean ran high, packed holds, poor food, disease moving fast through close quarters, and mortality on the estates themselves wasn't much better. Malaria and dysentery, cutting through labour lines, housed in the same barracks the enslaved had once occupied. Recruiters back in India had, by their own admission at the time, signed up people who were, in their words, perfectly ignorant of the place they were agreeing to go to, or the length of the voyage ahead of them. That phrase alone tells you everything about how free this free labor really was. If you're finding this one interesting, it's worth hitting subscribe, because we dig into stories like this, the ones Victorian Britain would rather you'd forgotten, every single week. Right, back to the sugar. Inside the refineries and the jam factories that were turning all this raw and indentured grown sugar into food for the British table, the work itself was grueling in its own right. Refinery floors in Silvertown and Greenock ran furnace-hot year-round, thick with the cloying, faintly burnt smell of molasses fumes, men working shifts around boiling vats of sugar liquor, where a slip meant a scalding, not a scratch. Jam factories like Hartley's ran on a different but equally relentless rhythm, women and girls stirring vast copper pans of fruit pulp and boiling sugar syrup for hours at a stretch, the air so saturated with sweetness it apparently made some workers sick of the smell of fruit for life. This was the unglamorous, unphotographed labor behind every jar on every working-class shelf, and almost none of the profit from it reached the hands doing the stirring. By the very end of the century, the state itself started for the first time to notice what all of this sugar had done to a generation of children. School medical inspections, which would expand properly after 1901, began in these final Victorian years to formally document what any London slum doctor could already have told you without a clipboard, that working-class children were arriving at school with dental decay and poor nutrition on a scale nobody in authority had previously bothered to measure. It was the first official paper trail connecting the diet Gladstone's free breakfast table had made universal to the bodies of the children eating it, and it arrived roughly a quarter of a century after the policy that caused it, far too late to help the generation that had already lost its teeth. By the 1890s, Henry Tate had accumulated one of the great sugar fortunes of the age, built on decades of refining at Love Lane, and on the cheap, industrial sugar habit the whole country had developed. And in 1897 he did something that put his name somewhere far more visible than a refinery ledger. He funded and opened a new public gallery in London, built specifically to house British art, on the understanding that it would carry his name. The Tate Gallery opened its doors that year, a building financed entirely by sugar money, sugar that had come off ships from Guyana and Mauritius, worked, in no small part, by the descendants of indentured contracts his own industry depended on. Nobody walking through those galleries admiring the paintings was thinking about a Bengali labourer's 5-year contract, or a Bootle jam worker's boiled sugar cough, or a docker's child with 3 teeth left in his head at the age of 9. That was rather the trick of it. A fortune built on cheap, exploited, occasionally coerced labour had laundered itself, entirely legally and quite deliberately, into a temple of national culture. Sugar money had bought respectability, and respectability, unlike a tooth, doesn't rot where anyone can see it. By 1901, the year the old Queen died, sugar had completed its journey from apothecary's rarity to the base layer of the British diet, eaten by rich and poor alike, several times a day, without a second thought from almost anyone consuming it. The infrastructure behind that transformation, the refineries at Love Lane and Plaistow, the jam works at Bootle, the Indenture ships still crossing from Calcutta, was running at a scale nobody in 1837 could have predicted. And the cost of it, the rotten teeth, the empty calories, the 5-year contracts renewed because there was no way home, had settled quietly into the background of ordinary British life, treated as simply how things were, rather than as a set of choices Parliament had made, one budget and one act at a time, across 7 decades. If this story's got its hooks in you, now's a good moment to subscribe, because there's another one just like it landing next week, and you won't want to have missed it. Back to how this one really ends. The reform, when it eventually came, was partial, slow, and aimed almost entirely at the wrong end of the problem. The Dentist Act had regulated who could call themselves a dentist, but it never touched the price of a dentist's chair, and so it never touched the mouths of the people who actually needed one. Indenture itself limped on past the end of Victoria's reign entirely unreformed in its essential character, contracts still binding, mortality still high, recruiters in Bengal still signing up, people who had no clear idea what they were agreeing to. The one thing that did change by 1901 was scale. Everything about sugar had simply gotten bigger, more people eating it, more people growing it, more money made from it, more teeth lost to it, and remarkably little of the moral unease that had once surrounded slavery itself ever attached to the industry that had quietly stepped into slavery's shoes. For the rich, by the close of the century, sugar had become something almost impossible to imagine 40 years earlier, unremarkable. A cube dropped into a china cup with a pair of silver tongs, taken without a second thought, exactly because it was now everywhere, for everyone. That's the strange arc of the whole story. Sugar started the Victorian age as a rationed, weighed, apothecary-grade rarity, and it ended the age so ordinary that a wealthy household barely registered using it at all. What had changed wasn't the substance. What had changed was who was paying the real cost of making it cheap, and that cost had simply moved further away, onto ships from Calcutta and into barrack rooms in Berbice, out of sight of anyone stirring a spoon in a London drawing room. Put the two ends of this story side by side, and the shape of it becomes unmistakable. 18 pounds of sugar a year in 1800, 90 pounds a year by 1900. 90 pounds. That's not a rise, that's a five-fold explosion in a single century, and almost the entire climb happened inside Victoria's 70-year reign. £1.50 of sugar every week for every person alive in Britain, cradle to grave, rich or poor. Imagine that stacked up on a kitchen table, week after week, year after year, multiplied across a population of tens of millions, and you start to get some sense of the sheer physical tonnage this single habit was pulling out of plantations worked, in large part, by people who hadn't fully chosen to be there. And that, in the end, is the real inheritance of the Victorian sugar habit. Not a taste, a structure. A structure where cheapness always won the argument against conscience, where a policy that made a prime minister popular in 1874 was quietly rotting the teeth of the children who'd benefit from it by the 1880s, and where an empire that told itself, loudly and often, that it had ended slavery in 1833 spent the rest of the century finding new names for the same arrangement and calling the whole thing progress. Picture one household to make the numbers real. A dock labourer's family in Bethnal Green in the last years of the century, living on perhaps £1 a week when the work was steady, which it often wasn't. Breakfast was bread, scraped thick with tuppenny jam, 2/3 sugar, 1/3 fruit pulp, and a pot of tea stewed strong and stirred with spoon after spoon of sugar bought loose by the ounce from the corner shop. Dinner, if there was meat at all, was thin on it, padded out with more bread, more jam, more of the same oversweetened tea. The children got a farthing some days, and a farthing bought a fistful of boiled sweets from an open jar on the counter, sugar on sugar on sugar, because it was the only pleasure their pocket money could actually reach. By the time the mother of that household turned 35, she likely had more gaps in her smile than teeth in it, and no shilling spare to see a dentist about either. That family never once thought of themselves as living inside an economic and political decision made by Parliament 20 years earlier. They just thought of it as an ordinary week, because by the 1890s, this was what an ordinary week looked like for millions of households exactly like theirs, from London to Manchester to Glasgow, all of them eating the same cheap, sweet, hollow diet that a free breakfast table budget had made possible, and a jam and confectionery industry had made irresistible. Multiply that one Bethnal Green household by the whole of industrial Britain, and the global production figures stop being abstract. 6.1 million tonnes of sugar a year by 1890, up from 570,000 tonnes 6 decades earlier, wasn't just a number in a trade ledger. It was millions of tons of cane and beet, cut, crushed, boiled and refined, funneled through docks at Liverpool and London and out onto corner shop counters in every industrial town in the country, so that a dock labourer's children could have their farthing's worth of boiled sweets and a mother could stir another spoonful into an already stewed pot of tea. The scale of the industry existed because the appetite existed, and the appetite existed because the price had been engineered, quite deliberately by men in Parliament, to make it that way. And underneath every ton of it sat the same unresolved arithmetic Britain never quite squared. £20 million paid out in 1833 to end slavery. £106,769 of that fortune landing in one family's hands, John Gladstone's, for over 2,000 human beings who had built his wealth. And what did those 2,000 people receive for their years of bondage? Nothing. Nothing at all. Not a shilling, not an acre, not an apology, just a change of legal status and for many of them a continuation of the same unpaid labor under the apprenticeship system that followed. That's the ledger sugar was actually built on, and no amount of Tate Gallery marble or golden syrup tins ever balanced it. Picture the scale a different way. 1.2 million Indian laborers moved to sugar colonies across 80 years is roughly the entire population of a major Victorian city, uprooted, shipped across oceans, and set to work in someone else's fields, not once, but as a slow, continuous drain lasting longer than most of the men and women involved would live. And 90 pounds of sugar a year per person works out to something you could genuinely stack on a kitchen table. Picture a sack of sugar roughly the size of a large sack of flour, sitting in the corner of every single household in the country, refilled every 12 months forever, for rich and poor alike. That's not a taste for something sweet. That's an entire nation's metabolism rewired inside a single lifetime. And the men who built the fortunes riding on top of that rewiring understood exactly what they had. Henry Tate's 400 tons a week at Love Lane wasn't feeding a niche market. It was feeding a habit that had become close to universal. Abram Lyle's ton of golden syrup sold in the very first week wasn't a trial run. It was a company discovering, almost by accident, that a mere byproduct of its main business could still outsell most other foodstuffs in Britain. Every one of these men, Tate, Lyle, Hartley, was riding a wave that had been engineered decades earlier by a chancellor's pen and a prime minister's budget speech, not by any innovation of their own. The innovation was never the sugar. The innovation was making the whole country need it. And that need never once stopped to ask where the sugar had come from, who had cut the cane, who had signed a 5-year contract they couldn't read the terms of, or what a decade of 2/3 sugar jam would do to a child's teeth by the time she was old enough to have children of her own. The son of a slaveholder made the nation's breakfast sweeter. He never once had to look at the fields, his father's fortune, and his own budget kept turning. By the time the century turned, the machinery of that hypocrisy had become so ordinary nobody even needed to notice it anymore. That, in the end, is the most Victorian thing about the whole story. It isn't that Britain committed a single dramatic betrayal, one bad decision on one bad afternoon in Parliament. It's that the betrayal got spread out, budget line by budget line, refinery by refinery, jam jar by jam jar, until it stopped looking like a betrayal at all and just looked like commerce. Nobody voting for the 1846 Sugar Duties Act stood up and said they were choosing slave-grown sugar over principle. They said they were choosing free trade, lower prices, a fairer deal for the British consumer. Nobody in Gladstone's cabinet in 1874 stood up and said they were about to fund a public health disaster. They said they were feeding the poor more cheaply than ever before. Both of those things were true. That's what makes it so hard to look away from. The cruelty wasn't hidden behind a lie. It was hidden behind an accounting trick, where the true cost of a cheap commodity simply got moved somewhere the person paying for their jam would never have to see it. A plantation in Berbice, a barrack room in Mauritius, a dentist's chair a labourer's wife could never afford to sit in. That's the trick sugar pulled off better than almost any other commodity of the age. It let an empire that genuinely believed it had done something moral in 1833 spend the rest of the century quietly undoing it, one cheap, sweet, entirely legal transaction at a time, and never once feel the weight of the contradiction, because the contradiction was doing its damage 3,000 miles away, or 30 years down the line, or 2 generations later in a child's mouth nobody in Westminster would ever examine. That was the state of things as Victoria's reign closed, a nation eating 5 times more sugar than it had at the start of her rule, its dentists watching a generation's teeth disappear, its jam factories and refineries running at industrial scale on the back of a labour system that had simply changed its paperwork rather than its nature, and its most celebrated philanthropists funding galleries and good works out of exactly the fortune that system had produced. Nobody planned the whole arc of it from the start. It assembled itself decade by decade, budget by budget, refinery by refinery, each individual step defensible on its own terms. Free trade, cheaper bread, a fuller breakfast table, and each one adding, without anyone quite choosing it, to a structure that fed an empire's sweet tooth on the back of somebody else's unfree years and somebody else's ruined mouth. That was the arithmetic sitting underneath every teapot in Britain by 1901. £1.50 of sugar a week for every single person in the country, poured out of a habit that had been built quite deliberately out of somebody else's stolen wages and somebody else's compensation check, and paid for, eventually, in somebody else's teeth. 70 years. 70 years to turn a rationed apothecary's ingredient into the single most consumed foodstuff in the British Isles, and not 1 year of it accidental. And that engineered arithmetic didn't stay confined to the account books of Whitehall or the ledgers of Mincing Lane. It sat every morning on the actual breakfast tables of a nation in a form so unremarkable that almost nobody eating it would have called it political. A spoonful stirred into tea was, by 1901, the quiet endpoint of nearly 70 years of parliamentary votes, plantation contracts and refinery furnaces, compressed into a gesture so small it took less than a second to perform and left no visible trace of everything that had gone into making it possible. And that single spoonful, repeated by millions of households every day of the year, was the real machine driving everything else in this story. Not Parliament alone, not the planters alone, not the refiners alone, but the simple compounding weight of an entire population's daily habit, multiplied across decades, until a taste that once needed defending in a budget speech no longer needed defending at all. It had simply become Britain. It was there in every mug of tea, stirred sweet without a second thought. It was there on every slice of bread, thick with 2/3 sugar jam, doing the work a proper meal couldn't afford to do. It was there in the compensation check paid to a slaveholder, and in the ship that carried his replacement labor from Bengal 5 years later. It was there in the smile of a working man, missing more teeth than he had left. It was there in the budget speech that made a prime minister popular, and in the epidemic it quietly financed. It's still there. It's in the jam on your toast, the tea in your cup, the tin of golden syrup barely changed since 1883. Britain still eats, on average, far more sugar than its great-great-grandparents ever dreamed possible, and most of us give it about as much thought as a Victorian did stirring his tea. Britain fought a war on slavery and won it. It never fought one on sugar. And sugar, quietly, is still winning. If you'd been offered cheap sugar in 1874, knowing where it came from and what it would do to your teeth, would you have said yes anyway? Tell us in the comments. And if this one got its hooks in you, hit subscribe and give it a like, so more people can find the story Victorian Britain never quite told about its own breakfast table.